in the abyss together, in that we might lose our friendship, we might lose our job, we might lose the opportunity to collaborate together on a wider scale to help create a better society, because we end up divided rather than working together.
Managing conflict in times of change, challenge, and crisis. This is the subject for our conversation today with someone who has become a dear friend over the last couple of years, Jane Gunn, who is known as the Barefoot Mediator. She's an expert in the field of conflict resolution. She's a trained mediator and facilitator. And as I mentioned, she's known to her clients and some of the wider world as the Barefoot Mediator. She's a commercial lawyer by background. She's listed as a global leader in the who's who of the mediation world. She's been featured in the Legal 500 Hall of Fame, president of the Chartered Institute of Arbitrators, and former director and board member of the Civil Mediation Council of England and Wales. I actually realized this morning, Jane, that I became familiar with your work prior to the pandemic when I was at a conference and one of the speakers referenced one of your books, which is goes by the title of How to Beat Bedlam in the Boardroom and Boardroom in the Bedroom, which was quite an intriguing title.
Yes.
And she referenced the book and how impactful it had been on her work and her life. And it only took me until this morning to connect the dots of how our paths had previously crossed in such a way. But for our audience, I've worked with Jane over the last year or so. Many of you know that I've taken on, firstly, the role of podcaster, content creator, trying examining this situation that we're going through. But increasingly, like others, the question becomes, what can we do about this situation? And therefore took the path of activism. And I've worked with lots of different activists and activist groups. And those of us who have been in the midst of the quote unquote freedom movement, if you will recognize there's lots of different characters, lots of different egos, lots of different personalities, lots of different ideas. And this hodgepodge of people who have come together to tackle common issues have had some interesting conflicts along the way. So Jane has played an integral role in helping to form a pathway to building bonds in order that we can collaborate. And I would say Jane has been entirely integral in actually, many people wouldn't see this. She's really kind of the secret weapon between some of the things that we've witnessed unfolding in the last couple of years. Some of the great successes that we've seen in the United Kingdom. We were discussing last night at Nick Hudson's Open Science event that England was the first to. We were also one of the first countries to successfully challenge a medical mandate through the NHS mandates. None of that, I believe, would have been able to happen if it wasn't for various different groups and individuals coming together to collaborate and co-create different campaigns and initiatives. And I think if I trace the steps back to some of the work that Jane's done, she's really helped galvanize and bring people together and find means of communication so that they can break through their own conflict. So I just want to honor you, Jane, for the role that you've played in what we've actually experienced in the last couple of years. But more broadly, I think Jane's work is as a mediator and someone as an expert in conflict resolution is of critical importance, because beyond activism, many of us watching this or listening to this will have experienced challenges in our communication as we discuss these really important issues with loved ones, friends, associates, colleagues, and come to points of disagreement that can result in arguments and even loss of friendships, or we've seen loss of marriages, relationships breaking down. So the type of conversation that we're going to have today, I think, will be of critical importance as we continue to navigate this piece, because as we move forward from what we've just experienced, it's going to be more and more important that we learn ways to relate more empathetically with each other, how we can create a culture of love and understanding and harmony and respect despite our differences. Because truly, if we are to make this world a better place and to avoid going through things like we've just been through again, we really do need to, as individuals and as a collective, to understand and transform in the face of this potential conflict, and start to understand how we can wake up to a deeper meaning and message, and understand how we can find harmony and balance in what appears to be an increasingly crazy world. So Jane has gone on a mission to help people in all walks of life to be what she calls resolutionaries. teaching people the basic skills of mediation, enabling people to deal with difference and diversity in ways that are non-adversarial and solution orientated. So I'm delighted to have you here, Jane, but I firstly wanted to honor you for the work that you've done and the support that you've given so many of us over the last year or so as we've tackled some of these big issues.
Oh, thank you, Dan. I really appreciate that. And, you know, I wouldn't call myself an activist. I'd call myself a questioner. Fervent curiosity is the thing that I have. And also as a lawyer, you know, one of the things we do as lawyers is we gather evidence. You know, it's normal that we would gather evidence from as far afield as we can. And then we weigh that evidence. We look at all the evidence side by side and say what resonates, what doesn't resonate, what's true, what's not true. And so the idea that we should, and that it would be normal to gather as much information about the current situation or any situation, frankly, that you're in, and then think, so what are my criteria for assessing that information? And then where do I go from here? And that's my job as a mediator, frankly. That's what I do.
Yes, well, back in the days of where normal rational thought occurred, that's how people in the legal profession and the scientific profession seemingly worked. But I won't allow my cynicism to disrupt this harmonious conversation. We were talking before we began this interview about your kind of orientation into this space around the COVID conversation. Would you mind just sharing the story of how your work was impacted by COVID-19, which led to an interesting keynote that resulted from the situation?
Yes, I will. I mean, back in March 2020, so before we really knew, I think there was, I know I had a trip. I was supposed to be going on a business trip to Bermuda in March 2020, and that was being called into question. But I wasn't really sort of thinking about it deeply. And then I got a call to say, would I come and speak at a London event, because an American speaker either didn't want to, wasn't able to travel to London. And I was in a taxi going around London with about 2 days to go. And I said, I don't have a keynote I don't have a keynote that's appropriate for this event. I don't have time to write one. I'm in a taxi. I've got a busy diary. The answer is no. And then as my journey continued, and all of this is about journeys, isn't it? My journey continued. All of these thoughts came flooding into my head about what I might talk about around this situation. So I rang back my colleague and said, actually, I have got the bones of a keynote. Some ideas have come to me, but I'm going to just have to sort of deliver it as it is, just thoughts that I've had over the last 2 days. And so the speech was called Corona Bonus. I'm happy to give you a link for people who are interested to watch it, because it's still out there on the internet. But what came to me was all sorts of ideas. One of them was about male and female energy, where does our energy come from in these kind of times? The other one was about how we seem to be rooted in fear, and we have been the last 2 years. And that actually, for me, that was the most dangerous virus, was the virus of fear. And this was 2 years ago, before we really had any of this had kicked off. So I was just looking at all sorts of the principles that have come to me over the last 25 years practicing in the field that I do. I'm thinking, how do they relate to this unfolding crisis, if you like? Yeah.
Yes, I mean, that's such an important level of awareness, because that, I think, as we unpack this conversation around conflict, I think the ever presence of fear has perhaps been a catalyst. I've been trying to work out where the conflict has originated from, because your point around curiosity, asking questions, that's the tagline of the Pandemic podcast, was question everything. I've been blessed with a natural curiosity that I've had since childhood, where it just wants me to understand the world. But it just seems that has not been so pervasively available. But in the presence of fear, that ability to be curious and to question assumptions and what we're presented, I felt frustratingly lacking. But I feel somewhat within there's the seed of the conflict. But interestingly, we're unpacking yesterday whether humans have become addicted not to crisis, because it may appear like that, going from COVID to conflict in Ukraine and other things, monkeypox, but rather addicted to drama. And I'm trying to kind of navigate, and I'd be very interested in your take on this, is what is the origin of these conflicts between us, the interpersonal conflicts in the context of these grand narratives that has led to fallouts, mass fallouts? A lot of people, it's led to them finding new friends and their own tribe, if you will, but it's also seen to break down a huge amounts of relationships. What for you, Jane, has been kind of the origin of some of those conflicts, and what does the theory of conflict teach us about what's gone on in the last couple of years?
Yes, well, let me start with that point on drama. I've got a book on my bookshelf out there. Everybody who knows me knows I've got thousands of books. There's always one on there. My daughters always say to me, "Mummy, you've got a book on everything," and I do. But this book is a book by a war journalist. It says war is a force that gives us meaning, and if you then sort of contextualize that, drama, crisis is a force that gives us meaning. And many people, once they've been through a crisis or they've served in a war or whatever, to go back to ordinary life seems rather boring. So we do thrive sometimes on crisis, because many of us, it can give us something to fight against. How we frame that fight, what actually our role in it is different. So that's one thing I think that the last 2 years has given to many people, a sense of purpose. We're fighting this thing, whatever it is, or this situation. And then to step back from that, it leaves a void. And one of the things we talked about before we came on was a void. So we might revisit that later. Conflict. And when I do my courses, I explain it like this. Most conflict comes from within. There are different theories of conflict. There's the sort of power domination theory of conflict. In other words, what you perceive, you see in an international conflict like Russia and Ukraine at the moment. One person or group of people trying to dominate another one. Then you've got the idea that it's all about rights. Who's more right than the other? And then you've got unpacking that, is there something underneath that? Is there something about needs and interests and values? But the other theory of conflict is simply this. It's a breakdown in the interaction between two people or two groups of people from moment to moment. And what happens in that interaction is that when we become absorbed in a particular conflict, a particular scenario, we do become self-absorbed. It's as though we're in a bubble. I can only see my story. I can only see my sense of what's going on. So we become very self-absorbed, and we're not able to see the other person's story at all. So we're not able to acknowledge that, recognize it, even willing to explore it. So this idea of asking questions to say, well, where might those other people be coming from, doesn't occur to us. We're literally in that bubble. And when you're in that bubble, you then become very defensive. You demonize others. We can see this has happened in society. The natural force of that is that we demonize others, and we become very defensive and aggressive even. And what you need to do, and what we do in mediation, is you need to try and create shifts to the opposite, which is being able to humanize people, to be able to collaborate with them, to be non-aggressive. You need to make shifts in what we call being able to recognize the other and empower them. How do you recognize someone else? Well, first of all, you listen to them. You humanize them. This is another human being with their own needs, interests, fears, and concerns. How do I understand that? Well, I understand that by getting to know them in some way. And how do I empower them? Well, I empower them by humanizing them, actually, by treating them as you are another person. I don't necessarily agree with you, but you have your right to your point of view, and let me hear it. So we do these two things, empowerment and recognition, and it's a slow process. But if you can sit down, or if in some way you can start a dialogue or another interaction and say, let me hear things from your point of view, let me understand you, let me understand your history, even in the context of an international dispute. And I was reading more about the history of the war in Ukraine this morning. It's very complex. We in the West here sitting, watching the news or read the newspaper, we have no idea of the historical context of this. It needs a lot of exploration, which most of us haven't done. So we make then inferences, judgments, and assumptions, and we base our understanding of a situation on a tiny amount of information that very often we've been fed by someone else. So that's sort of the theory of conflict, and you know where it, and then it's coming from within. From within most of us, it's based on that sense of fear of the other.
Wow. Okay. There's so many threads that I would like to unravel here. I actually made some notes as we went along to make sure I captured all of those points. On the latter piece here around the complexity, you're right. You know, off the back of the pandemic content that we created, there was this request for us to examine what's going on in Ukraine and Russia on the podcast. And I had zero geopolitical background understanding. So I felt uncomfortable entering into the conversation on the kind of what I would call the factual propositional level. But the heart in me, the kind of loving soul within me wishes for a world without violent conflict and wants my son to grow up in a world without such conflict. So on one hand, I felt unable to enter into the conversation, but on the other, felt compelled. But as it happened, started to examine the complexities. We've had 3 podcast interviews on this subject, and it's interesting. All 3 have tackled the history, but all from different lenses. All 3 conversations are entirely different. You could listen to all 3 back to back, and if you're only to take one of those, and that's where you draw your conclusions and understanding from, you're likely to miss. And they're all nuanced individuals, but that they all bring it from a different lens. And I think we culturally have this problem of oversimplification that takes us away from understanding that complexity. But of course, then when it comes to our relating with others, we are coming from that place of oversimplification. And if it's one person's oversimplified view of the world versus another, you're playing on a very awkward battleground where there's really the only scope is for conflict, surely.
Yeah, I think that's right. And you know, if you take any legal case, so part of my day job is mediating legal disputes where people have already issued proceedings against each other, spent a lot of money on expensive lawyers and so on. But each of those groups, you know, the claimant and so on, and the other party have got their group of lawyers and their supporters, and each of them sees a completely different version of events. And they're all highly qualified, highly trained, but they still don't see things the same way, and they still need to go to court or come to mediation to find a way forward. So that's how we get stuck. And you know, in a minute I can talk to you about the process of escalation, because it's very interesting to understand how we get to that point.
Yes, well, I think perhaps where we can look at that is through, because you talked about seeing each other's stories, and I think the problem with this is that each party to the conversation feels like the other is not paying attention and listening. You know, that they both sides feel unheard. You know, for instance, a lot of people who've been critically analyzing the COVID science and the political narratives have struggled to convey their views to others. But therein, to me, lies part of the problem, is we're trying to influence and persuade others to our way of thinking without first understanding someone else's map of the world. It reminds me of an example. I was talking to a friend of mine, and it surprised me how he was so aligned to the dominant storyline of the day, because I associated him with someone that would see what I saw. But when we spoke, I had this idea that he was falsely afraid of the virus because of the major storylines, the stock ticks of deaths, etc. But it turned out that he was not concerned, but his mother is elderly with cancer and other health implications, and he was desperately frightful of losing his mother.
Yes.
And of course, we know that the virus is an age-graduated condition, and the reality is that it would be a real threat or potential threat to his mother.
Yeah.
So but it's interesting how quickly we can judge someone. Again, you saw the layers, my assumptions about another person.
Yes.
And it wasn't until I had that conversation that I saw their map of the world and could empathize with it. And I did have the opportunity to share some different perspectives that they were able to take on board for themselves, but it still left an uncomfortable void for his personal situation with his family, because quite rightly, he didn't want to lose his mother, or even see the threat. But it's where we miss those opportunities to connect and relate, I think, is where we create the greatest problem, because we operate on that surface level with our view versus someone else's. And I've had plenty of situations myself over the last 12 months, 24 months, where it's gone the opposite way, and I've gone onto a telling rant and tirade, and it's just backfired incredibly. Then the heat of the passion of wanting to convey the information, and it causes deep frustration within myself, but actually, because it pulls you apart, doesn't it? But you actually push each other away. So how do we flip that? or rather, before we answer how we flip that, let's talk about that escalation point then, because what may have begun as because I've experienced that, what may have begun as a polite, convivial conversation can end up in a shouting match.
So I suppose, yes, there's two things I'd like to then, convey to you that contextualize all this. So one is this model of escalation. So the conflict itself, let's start there, is a process. It's a process by which we express our unhappiness with another person or a situation or a group of people. So it's our behaviors, do I shout at you? Do I cut you off? Do I ignore you? Whatever we do. That's the process of conflict. And it starts from the moment we have this sense of unhappiness with the other person to the moment it becomes, it's become a deadlock, or, we cut our friendship or whatever. So during that time where we're expressing in different ways our feelings of unhappiness, we've got a window of opportunity to turn things around. So that's the first thing. The second thing is conflict escalates. So the first thing you do, I always talk about conflict as being a conversation that didn't happen or didn't happen well. So it's the interaction, the conversation, the ability to interact well with someone else that breaks down. We may still be talking to them, but as you say, I'm shouting at them, I'm giving them information, not working. Then what we tend to do when we're frustrated with others is we tend to go and tell someone else. If that conversation isn't working, well, I'll go and have a conversation with someone else who does see my point of view. So we might go home to our partner and say, I'm really frustrated with so-and-so, guess what they've done, guess how they see things, so we do that. Sometimes that's a professional advisor. It might be a coach, might be a lawyer. And then we gather around us a group of people who see things our way. And you talked about all of us, Dan, having joined groups in this last time, but we join a group, and we always do that, whether it's our church group, our choir group, whatever. We join groups of people who tend to see the world the same as us, and we've got our own story, and then other people over here have got their own story. And then those groups, those stories become embroidered, I suppose. They develop their own life. And then from there become actions and even threats. So if you don't see the world as I see the world, either this will happen to you, or I will do this. In my case, in the legal world, it's, well, I'll issue some proceedings, or I'll lodge a grievance, or I'll lodge a complaint. There's a formal action point. But the interesting thing at the end of this escalation process are two things. The first is what we fear most is loss of face. What we fear most is loss of face. And the second thing is or the final step is into the abyss together. And if we're not able to backtrack, we often end up in the abyss together, in that we might lose our friendship, we might lose our job, we might lose the opportunity to collaborate together on a wider scale to help create a better society, because we end up divided rather than working together. So that's the escalation thing. And the important thing to understand about this is it's a process. Once it starts, it's almost like being on an escalator. Somebody needs to press that red button at the bottom and say, stop. We're going too fast. We're going into the basement. We need to stop. We need to rewind. We need to de-escalate this. So that's the escalation process, and it is important to see as a process that we just get drawn into without even thinking about it.
Yes, and that's escalation process can happen rather rapidly at times.
Yes, absolutely.
Zero to red.
Yeah.
What I'd like to unpack here, and it may lead us to, because the part you talked about, void of meaning and purpose at the beginning, I think there's some stepping stones towards that conversation, because that piece around being defensive and demonizing others, we don't like to admit it, but it's and there's, when I say either side of the debate, there is much more complexity than this or that. But in simple terms, in terms of the narrative, we've got two distinct groups that are at different polarities of the conversation, but both are doing the same. Being defensive, demonizing others. We don't like to admit it, but it's happening. And what it struck for me personally, and I came face to face with my own shadow in this, really, is I recognize that I've spent quite a lot of my life being defensive, and feeling like I need to defend my point of view. And I've started to unpick and unravel this, and what I realize is I've struggled in many ways to be understood or feel understood in my communication. And many people say that, I'm a very articulate speaker and communicator, and that on occasion may be true. But there's a lot of my life where I see things differently because of the nature of my mind. And then being able to try and explore and navigate those complexities with others without finding a common baseline to enter the dialogue and the conversation has been of great frustration. But that frustration has mounted over the years, which has led to much quicker points of defensiveness. But it leads to great dissatisfaction, because I come away feeling that I'm just not being understood. And it in many ways feels like it becomes a vicious circle, and the problem perpetuates. By the deeper it goes, the lack of, when you start to feel like you're not being understood by others, it can lead you to feeling very defensive, but also withdrawn within yourself. That's something I've grappled with most of my adult life. What then, in the context of that, how do we create the conditions where either party can be understood, and to mitigate against that? Because I almost feel like I'm jumping on that escalator halfway up the point, before before we even started. I haven't even started at the bottom. Somehow parachuted onto the middle step.
Yeah, I know what you mean. I think going back to this saving face point, it's so interesting to understand. And before we started, and I'll repeat it here, that part of my experience this week has been about how vulnerable we all are. Even the highest qualified professionals actually feel very vulnerable inside. And I know various people have commented on this, particularly Brené Brown and so on. But it's such an important point to come back to, particularly in times of crisis, is to recognize that we actually, all of us, feel vulnerable. We may look up to some people as being more highly qualified than us professionally or whatever, and think surely they don't feel vulnerable, but they do. And this sense of vulnerability does play into some of our behavior. So this week I've done work with two very highly professional groups of people, doctors and lawyers. And, one group says to me, to a degree, we all feel a lack of self-belief and self-confidence. And then, there are these levels of hierarchy to which we're all aspiring in our practice or in our, in our group. I've always got to jump to the next level. Where I am isn't good enough. There's this sense of I'm not good enough as I am. And that creates that vulnerability. So at the rawest end of it, and some of the work I've done over the last couple of years has been with an organization called Against Workplace Bullying. That sense of somebody being a bully comes from, and that sense of somebody being on that side, that negative side of the conflict interaction, is fueled by that sense of void, that sense of I don't feel good enough about myself. And that then plays out or is transferred onto others. it's all very complex. We as human beings are far too complex, you know, because we've got all these layers of stuff. And it's not only our stuff, it comes from generations of, you know, generations of what? Historical conflict, you know, family stuff, all of that is built into each one of us, plus all the things that we ourselves have experienced as we've been growing up and so on. So I think that creates this, the complexity in us and humans, the fact that we just do have this void, we don't feel confident in ourselves necessarily. And once we recognize that, and once we can recognize that in others and know that actually what do they need? They don't need us to make them feel even smaller.
Yes.
They don't need that. They need recognition and encouragement and acknowledgement. And that's what all of us need. And I just felt that very much this week, that those were the things that were missing, that we forget to do: recognize, acknowledge, and then encourage each other. And especially when we don't agree.
Yes. Well, these all lead me onto a conversation that I had with Professor Matthias Desmet, who's coming back on the show to talk about his new book, The Psychology of Totalitarianism, in the very near future. But he spoke about the meaning crisis. He spoke about the background anxiety, free-floating anxiety, as he described it, social discontent, and a fourth factor, which eludes me at this moment. It always eludes me, but the fourth one, probably the most important one. But this came up in a conversation yesterday, where, in the context of Matthias's work, where he said that 30% of us will see things differently, but only a proportion of those will actually go on to take any form of action based upon what they see. And this came up in the conversation around academia and institutions, and there was this analysis of how academia has become a very linear process. There's a very lack of lateral thinking, creative thinking that gets to challenge the status quo. It's almost been suppressed out of the academic process. But as a result, we've got people within academia who perhaps recognize some of the flaws in the science, but there's something within them that prevents them from actually having the courage to go against the grain. And there's certain factors that are a bit more material, in the sense that they could lose their funding, they could lose their job, lose their livelihood, they've got families to take care of. But the discussion led us to this idea that perhaps we've got this not only void in meaning, but a void in self-belief and self-esteem within humankind. And yes. I'd be interested to unpack that under the context of conflict. How does that show up in human relations?
I just think it shows up. I have a model which I look at called the 4 C's of collaboration. And the first one of those is about connection. And one of the things is that sometimes we inadvertently, in the way we respond to others, make them feel less than. Just the words we use, the sense that perhaps somebody hasn't done what we expected them to do, stepped up, whatever. And the second thing in that particular element of that model is, do we make some people feel in the in crowd and other people are excluded, they're out? And we can do that in many ways these days. I mean, technology and social media is just complicated all of this, that we create groups and senses of groups. But if there's a sense that I am excluded and not good enough, and there's a sense that I am less than someone else, that just gets built, that just creates the fuel for conflict, I suppose. Then we have, am I treating somebody with fairness and respect and consideration? And a lot of these things we do without thinking about it, without knowing it. And then we, the person who feels offended, sometimes doesn't know how to articulate that sense of, I felt you made me feel like this. And it's not about whining all the time. And one of my speaker colleagues has got a campaign against global whining. I think that's wonderful. It's too much whining going on. It's not about encouraging people to whine, but I think sometimes we create conditions that just then, as we've said, get amplified and escalate because we misinterpret the communication, and sometimes because we feel less than, our interpretation, our communication to somebody else can be deliberately sort of, you know, if I make you feel less, I'll feel more. Sometimes that's going on. You know, if I use words that cut you down, I'll feel better about myself. It doesn't necessarily work, but that sometimes is the way that communication goes. And the answer to all of this, Dan, is to become more conscious, to become more aware of what is it I am actually doing and saying, and that others are actually doing and saying that's creating a reaction in me. And that's quite hard work, because we battle our way through every day. Start thinking about and analysing every bit of communication. But it is about just understanding, you know, are there ways in which I'm communicating with somebody, particularly somebody I'm not necessarily on the same wavelength with, that's just fueling our division, really? And could I change that in some subtle way that would just bring us closer together, simply by going back to those elements of, if I acknowledged and recognized that person rather than cutting them down, would that work a little bit?
Well, I'd like to extract that a little more in the context of what I shared around the academics, because I identified that there are some forces, it could be financial or otherwise, that makes it difficult for people to go against the grain. But I'm curious to explore whether it's possible to avoid conflict. Is it something that is just a natural part of our existence? Because let's take that academic. Let's suppose they do find the courage to go against the grain. And let's be frank about this. Most of the scientific leaps in understanding have come as a result of people having the courage to go against the grain and challenge the norms. That's what leaps in science have come from. So that it's actually part of the inbuilt process of innovation, evolution of science. But in the context where you have a dominant worldview, to then stand out from the crowd and say something that is contrary to what seems to be the consensus or the illusion of consensus and majority, does that, in essence, is the game set up for then for conflict to occur? Or can, when that individual who's going away from the crowd do so in a way that actually creates the space or invokes the space for meaningful dialogue without instantaneously resulting in a conflicting experience? I'm very curious about that.
Gosh, there's lots of questions there, Dan. Lots of things to explore. Avoiding conflict. You know, when mediation started becoming popular, people started giving courses on how to avoid conflict. I don't think we should, or that it's reasonable to think we can avoid conflict. So one of the things I describe conflict as is water. If you don't water your garden, it's not going to grow and flourish. But the trouble is, if it rains too much, your garden will become a muddy quagmire. So, you know, neither is very good. So what we do is, we know it's going to rain, and so we catch water in different ways. You've got a water butt in your garden, you take an umbrella, so on and so on. We catch water. So it's understanding it is going to rain. That's good for my garden, but I need to filter it through a hose or, you know, catch it in a water butt. So that's the essence. So I run courses called The Magic of Conflict, because I think conflict is the magic ingredient, but we must catch it early. And then resolve it simply that I know what, so, and we've got to channel it. Then I know what I need to do with it. You know, I need to go and have a conversation with that person rather than escalating it by talking to my whole group behind their back, for example. So that's catching it early, resolving it simply. It's simply a framework to say, I know what I ought to do with this. Most people say, when I do a poll on a course, that they will either avoid conflict or deny it, or because they don't want to rock the boat. So there is this sense of nobody wants to put their head above the parapet. I'm rather like you, Dan. I always have done that. It's nothing new to the circumstances we're in now. I've always been happy and willing to stand out and say what I think and what I feel. Many people don't feel that for different reasons. And so how do we support that? I mean, I don't feel society does support that at the moment. In many different circumstances, it's just not welcome. And perhaps in academia, it's not welcome. And sometimes that's because the alternative view threatens something that is very long established, maybe a long established, scientific paper that somebody with high credentials wrote, and they don't want that to be overturned. It's like somebody not wanting their Olympic their Olympic medal status to be overturned. We value those status symbols that we have, and I think sometimes people don't want those to be undermined because somebody comes up with an alternative point of view. And so that's, I think, what happens, whether it's in politics or science or in law. When somebody has made a pronouncement that this is the way forward, and that it's based on these credentials, it takes a lot of courage to then say, but what about this? Or why haven't we done it that way? And so many people, the majority of people, would rather stay quiet because it's easier to stay quiet, and for valid reasons. Sometimes, I might lose my job if I speak out against the chief executive, or I might lose my status in society, or I might be thrown off Facebook or LinkedIn. Those things are real things that can happen to us and have an impact on us. So there are reasons, valid reasons, why people don't speak up. But we don't live in a society that encourages us to explore that alternative view. And I think that's a shame.
Yes. Yeah. So as you were speaking, I was thinking, I looked up the origin of the term conflict in preparation for this conversation, and it actually comes from a Latin word, conflictus, which means to contend, fight, or struggle. And I think the presupposition, perhaps, that conflict will occur, as I was thinking about the story that I shared about someone speaking against the grain, and I appreciate everything you said about those preserving the norms that have come from that. But it struck me, I've been listening to a podcast which was recorded with Professor Donald Hoffman, he is challenging some of the very principles of our nature of reality, including the concept of space and time, and some really, deeply held physical principles from the world of physics, but also the world of neuroscience. But the way in which he's approached it, and I think the way in which things are done, is what's important. And it's very interesting. He's approached it from a very open and humble perspective, saying, here's my take on the assumptions that were made that led to these conclusions. And here's my assumptions and the approach I'm taking to look to invalidate my own assumptions. He's saying, I'm here to try and actually falsify what I am starting to observe, and in doing so, he's not coming to say, hey, I've got a new grand theory of everything. Everything that precedes it is wrong. Ha ha.
Yes.
Aha, aha, oh ha ha. He's coming at it with a very humble perspective. And as he examines scientifically held assumptions or theories, he's very respectful of those things. And as a result, I think if that particular notion, when you challenge something as deep as space and time and our perception of reality, if that could really rock the boat in some significant ways. But I think the means in which he's approached it, therefore, and undoubtedly, I'm hoping to get him on the podcast. Undoubtedly, there'll be people who will furiously disagree with him. But it was just interesting because I think the nature of the way that we enter into conversation about differences of our opinion, it comes back to what's within us and how that shows up in our communication. And it's very, very hard transitioning to Elevate because we've started to examine some of these inner game challenges, recognizing it's part of the problem. But it's almost like the barriers are there for people. That people don't want to look within to see how they are part of the problem, as well as observing how we're witnessing the problem in others. But my entire worldview has been, if I can see problems in others, it probably exists within me as well in order to know it. And I think to actually move beyond these conflicts that we're having, and actually, because as I found that definition of conflict, the presupposition, therefore, that we will contend, fight, or struggle, I mean, that's not a world that creates the conditions for open dialogue, because we can have different perspectives. You and I, Jane, I'm sure if we, expanded our lens to look beyond the matters that we've had in common for the last couple of years, we would probably find tons of points of difference. But I'd hope to think we could still hold the space for that reflection and respect each other's worldview on that. So this is a leading conversation to ask the question: how do we then create the conditions where we can have meaningful conversation? How do we set up the game? How do we set up the conversation before we even begin? That creates the opportunity to respectfully discuss, unpack, and debate.
I mean, on a very simple level, Dan, I think if you're going into you're going into a difficult conversation, it's about understanding. I mean, at a very rules-based level, you could have some ground rules, but if I'm running a mediation, it's there are some simple values, if you like, about how people will treat each other. So I suppose it's about, at some level, having that understanding that we will have this conversation according to some rules, if you like. There will be some rules, some understanding. If you haven't had any training in conflict resolution, you need some framework around that conversation that makes it safe. That's why I go into a conversation as a neutral third party, because just me sitting there, I am, as you say, holding the space. I'm holding the space for people. And because I'm sat there and because we've got a framework around that conversation, it's more than likely to be constructive. And because if the parties don't do that, I will do the reflecting and the acknowledgement and all of that we've talked about before. So it's about having that framework for the conversation and trying to follow it. So, and then, yes, it is this awareness that actually where's the conflict coming from? For all of us, it's within. And that's where we have got to do the work. And it is so easy to project outwards and say, well, we've got to do this, or the government have got to do that, and we need to do this. This is the solution. No, the solution is here. The solution is within us. And we've talked before when we've been in a room down and said, everything we need is within this room. It is. Everything we need is we already have it. We don't need new inventions. We don't need new ways forward. We already have everything we need, and it's within us. But we have to find it. And, this can seem too vague for some people, I think, but it is about exploring that void that has become a societal void, I think. If there is a lack of meaning and purpose across the board, and we talked again before we came on air about, there's a foundation of trauma. We do have we have a culmination of of historic trauma, I suppose, whatever that is, whether that's family trauma, international trauma. Many people have experienced trauma in their lives or in their family generations, and that gets carried forward. And then you've got this sort of sense of lack of meaning and purpose, lack of self-beliefs, lack of because some people will listen to this and go, no, I don't feel any of that at all. That's not me. I don't believe it. And it's not to say, we're all walking around feeling with our heads down, feeling gloomy and helpless and hopeless. It's not it at all. It's just acknowledging that these senses do exist within each of us, and we're very good at covering them up. But they are the trigger sometimes for some of the things that go wrong when we do get triggered. And so most of us can operate in the world within the sphere that we've carved out for ourselves. If I'm a professional lawyer, I can act like a professional lawyer, and I can exist in that world and feel very confident in that world. But many of us operate with our confidence comes from our titles, not from our talent. And so what is my talent? If you take away my title, very kind of you, Dan, but you introduced me as Jane's this and that. She's in, and that's lovely. And it is nice to have that acknowledgement. If you take all that away and say, who is Jane? I'm not those things. Those are not me. Those are things I have achieved or acquired along the way. But who am I really? And that's a really hard thing to ask people when they're striving for the next badge, the next level, the next honor. And many of us in society are made to believe, even if we're not doing that on a professional level, how many likes have I had on Facebook today? How many people have looked at my TikTok thing? We just live in that world that measures us and measures our ability to be successful by those things. So it's about title, not talent. And we should go back to looking at, but what is my innate talent in this world? So that's another big question.
Yes, it is. Jane, I want to address a particular conflict that's emerging here, because for the listeners and the viewers, just forgive me for a moment. I've realized that in our scheduling of this conversation, the manual nature of doing so has given us an hour, but we now usually allocate 90 minutes. But I want to make sure we don't tread upon a diary conflict on your side. So I just want to check in with you.
No, I'm all right. I've got to leave for another appointment at 11, so
okay,
we've got another half an hour.
Conflict averted.
Yeah, we didn't see that. That's a good point. We didn't check in on that, and that could have been something that was challenging. Yeah,
well, isn't it? Yeah, because we set the frame, and then we also, without setting that condition, the frame, the parameters of the conversation. You know, it's interesting to just even layer that context out in terms of the nature of the conversation, because we had at the beginning some discussion around what's alive right now, what's most important for us to cover. And what we explore, but we didn't look at the mechanics. And pre-agree that actually this time is the hard stop. You know, it's even those subtleties are actually important, because what could have become very uncomfortable was that, you know, I'm continuing and you could
I'm looking at the
clock thinking actually Zoom call or meeting, which then puts us in uncomfortable. So actually, it's really interesting to. Oh, Siri, I've just triggered Siri. I said the word Zoom call and Siri, Siri's got involved. Siri's got a question. So, okay, let's expand upon this. And well, here's where it gets interesting. I was listening to your point around the titles and talent, because quite frankly, Jane, you know, having got to know you, there's some wonderful platitudes that I could share. You know, I think you're a beautiful soul. I think you're an incredibly brave and conscious leader. You know, an incredibly articulate speaker. I know that you've been a rock for others throughout this period. You know, you've held the space. You've got an infectious smile that really brings joy into the conversation. And these are all, I think, you know, these are all genuine reflections for myself. But
thank you.
Even when we go from that to, because we could talk about commercial lawyer, Barefoot Mediator, into these, but they're still labels, really. You know, I wonder if there's almost this like, which there's a lead into this, because there's almost that unseen divinity of us, our spiritual, soulful nature that's beyond words. It's beyond labels. It's an essence that's alive within us. And Nick Hudson spoke about this last night as a God-shaped whole, and whether you look at it from a religious point of view or a spiritual perspective, or even just a pure rationalist perspective, looking at a void of meaning and purpose, perhaps, is there something beyond the pure rational nature of thought and discussion and engagement that we're perhaps missing, that is actually leading to some of these more challenging times?
I mean, I personally think there is, Dan. I mean, you know, I'm trained as a lawyer. That's a very rational, you know, you can talk about it as a left brain. I don't know where we've got to with where the brain operates and all this thinking. But yeah, we can be very rational and we can be very logical about things. And I think that's part of the challenge in the way we try and solve problems and understand ourselves. We try to be rational, but there is this emotional and then this deeper spiritual thing. And I think you're right in that we can't then label what that is and what that looks like and what it means. And for myself, and others may not feel that, I certainly feel guided by something to do the work that I do. You know, I can't explain it. So when I wrote that speech back in March 2020, it sort of downloaded in about 10 minutes. I can't explain where it came from. And, you know, other people will have a rational answer for that. But my work, I feel, is a calling. And I do feel that there's a sense in which there is a deeper meaning to it. For me, I can't explain where that comes from. I could ignore it if I like and go more over into the rational, and but how do we find that in ourselves and in others? And you're a new father, Dan, and I've got 3 little granddaughters, and it's just interesting to watch them and the joy they experience in life when they're not sick.
Yes.
But the joy and the delight they experience in life, and to be with them. And there's something in that I think we are missing. I can't, again, what is it that's missing? That joy-like sense of just being who they are. I mean, my granddaughter Emmy doesn't mind what labels she's given. She just wants to, she just wakes up wanting to enjoy the entire day and to play with it. And we've lost that sense of innate joy, playfulness, I think. If we were to look at some of these problems, say, how can I play with them rather than how can I solve them? Can I play with this problem? Can I find some fun in the way I explore it, I suppose. And we don't do that. And yet when we do, we know that when we do, we can be much more creative. We can be much more creative in solving things when we stop trying quite so hard. I developed this idea of slow mediation and zigzag mediation, because I think we try too hard to go from A to B. We think I must get to B and I must get there as quickly as possible. And the difference is, if you're in a motorboat and you say, I need to get to B, then you will get to B as fast as possible, and you'll carve through all the waves and the wind and everything, and you'll get to B. And if you're in a sailing boat, you'll have to be alert to the wind and the waves and the weather and whatever else is going on, and someone's seasick, you've got to get it. And so you've got to tack your way. And you've got to be more aware, more alert. And then you might decide halfway across where you're going, actually, because there's a storm coming, I need to go to sea. So it's this level of being much more aware and alert to what's going on within and without, and being able to adjust and play with situations and thoughts and ideas, and instead of just carving our way straight to the next goal and the next destination.
Yes, I think that the spiritual texts, religious texts, personal development literature in different ways has addressed this point around our consciousness, our awareness, our presence, detaching from the noise around us to really be in the moment, to be in awe. This word awe for me is one that's come up in the last few days. And it's just the pure wonder of existence. This morning I look out and see the sun is shining. I've had barely any sleep because Zach's been awake all night. And maybe I'm in a sort of state of hysterics that's been brought on by a lack of sleep. But I just see this blue sky, and it just brought this grounding feeling of, wow. Doesn't matter if I've had no sleep. This life is incredible. It's just this.
I agree.
Coming back to that awe. And it takes us to a higher state. And I remember prior to me being ejected from Twitter last week, which can rapidly take you out from that higher state, feeling like I was going to get into this debate on Twitter. There was something that really irked me. I thought, I have to give my 10 cents on that. But I did just pause and come back to a present moment and just breathe and think, okay, what's the most appropriate way to respond to this situation? Firstly, within myself, how do I manage my own reaction to this? Because it is a reaction that triggers a reaction. It's not a conscious response. It's an unconscious, trigger that's just alerted the, code red in the system. So to come down from code red into a present moment. So what's the most appropriate way for me to respond? And I was thinking then in terms of words and what I could say and how I could acknowledge their point of view and demonstrate empathetic communication. But then I went to another level and said, what would my divine self respond in this situation? And the answer was totally different than I expected. the divine self would not be on Twitter right now. So it's like, okay, close Twitter, avoid problem, get back to that higher state and doing something meaningful. And it was just interesting to just catch myself in that moment. And I just, I wonder how much of the systems and structures, the technologies that we are now facing actually proliferate this. And someone said to me the other day that, it was Brett Weinstein. He said that, the problem with social media is if someone had that type of conversation with you in a physical space and they irked you, there's always the physical threat that someone might grab you or, hit you. Whereas in social media, there's no consequence. You don't speak to people as human beings necessarily. There's a lower level of decorum that comes in these social spaces. What's your take on how we can embody some of the principles you've talked about in the digital realm, given that we are living in an incredibly more digital environment?
It's a good question, Dan. A lot of my clients have said to me how their meetings have become more functional and less fun. So it's like, how can we make me? One of the things I'd say to people actually when I'm thinking about planning meetings, I do a workshop on how to run better meetings, and I think about your meeting as a dinner party. If your meeting was a dinner party, you would be thinking about, well, where are people going to sit? How are they going to be able to hear each other, see each other? Are they going to have enough food? Are they going to have enough drink? So sometimes it's important to think of yourself, if you're hosting a meeting, you're going to a meeting. If I was hosting a dinner party, how would I look after people? It'd be my job to look after everybody, and sometimes if you're not the host, you're still the one that looks after everybody. But it's an important frame, again, to think about myself as hosting others and needing to make them feel comfortable. Can they be seen and can they be heard? And I think that's one of the challenges online, is can we really see and hear each other? And a real challenge about people talking over each other, because you just don't get the senses, when is it my turn to talk? So you often get someone who's talking over others, and then other people who never say anything, or they turn the camera off. So we need, I suppose, to create, some again, like you've done for this meeting, a framework. How are people going to have a chance to talk? Are we going to ask people to put their cameras on? When do we have breaks? I mean, I know people, they just want to plow through 2 hours of meeting without a break, just because, time seems important. And why would we not have a break? We'd have a coffee break if we were in a physical yes. setting, but we seem to think, because we're digital, we're digital people as well, we don't need these kind of comfort breaks, or we do. So I just think we've got to be, again, it is about awareness and consciousness, and about thinking, what is it that makes people feel comfortable and relaxed, and also able to participate? Because people who are happy to speak up in a room are not so happy to speak up online. So how do you encourage? Again, it's this encouragement and acknowledgement. How do you do that to draw people out and say, I notice you haven't said anything. Have you got something to say? Or some people just turn their cameras off and hide, don't they? Or don't even come to digital meetings. And can we do something else that creates a bit more fun? So I'm talking about, a meeting itself, but, we can be very functional online. We've got to get through this conversation, but how could we have some fun with it? How can we create? That's just me. I'm always wanting to laugh.
Yes. Yeah, I agree.
I think it's important. One of the values for my business is to laugh. And that really means we should bring humor and humility into our conversations. Even if they're serious, it doesn't mean we can't have some sense of humor about what we're talking about.
Yes. It's so powerful. I mean, a lot of us have, just as last week, I've met people through some of the events that have been happening in London and Bath that I've been conversing with online really for 2 years, and see them in person. It's so enlivening and wonderful. Yes. But of course, the Zoom piece, and we had physical meetings over the course of the week, and it's just, you end up it can be in some form of enlightened small talk. You don't have to go just to the simple, it's bright day today, a bit gloomy today. The usual kind of like weather related small talk. but at least there's that rapport building that comes. You can be
Yes.
grabbing a coffee together. How's the
Yes.
kids?
Yeah.
How's your wife getting on? That builds rapport ahead of a meeting. Whereas in a digital space, you tend to just get going. And like you say, 2-hour meetings, and perhaps those people who turn the camera off have gone to get a coffee, or
I think they probably have. Or have a lie down or something.
Have a lie down, stuff their face. I'm having a breakfast off they go. But I think what I take from that is, again, it's setting the scene. Before we had this conversation, because this is a podcast interview which can come with some preconceived notions that the host is going to ask the questions and the guest is going to respond. But I said, it's Friday morning, let's have a coffee conversation today, which creates a frame where I can participate in the conversation as well. So we have a dialogue.
Yeah.
And we have to set the scene, I think. But also, what was clear to me last night at the Open Science event, the Quest for Open Science, is the lost art of debate. And there's a skill to it. I think we almost need to retrain ourselves in the skill and the practice of debate, but not just debate, in fact, just relating. And even relating online as a separate skill set, because you're right, the visual cues of this person's going to speak now, or the pause is actually because they're reflecting and about to say something else, and not a cue for the next person to jump in. It's creating frameworks and practices, and I've been part of some wonderful experiences online over the last few months, in particular, where I've sought this expertise because I want to learn it. And there's so many practices available that, I'm in my awe and curiosity of learning about the art of human communication at a deeper level. And I think it's almost we need to go back to school and school ourselves in a digital world on how to communicate online and offline, because we're more connected than ever, but more disconnected than ever.
I think that word disconnection is a good one, Dan. I think we are disconnected, and we do feel disconnected on some levels. And, we can't perhaps express what that is or what it feels like or how we bridge the gap. I'm quite interested in how do we create bridges, really? How do we create a bridge between where we are now and where we want to go? That's the thing, isn't it? It is a sense of we've got some work to do to create something which is a bridge. Many of us have a sense of, we can see that we would like things to be different. We'd like a different world. We'd like one that is, more peaceful, as you say, where our children and grandchildren could grow up in safety. But what's the bridge? What's the bridge between where we are now and how we get to something like that? And that's our job, I think, is to look at that bridge and say, what are the components of it? What holds it up? Yes. I actually came across someone on LinkedIn. She's the candidate for the she's an independent candidate for governor of California. And she's campaigning on the 7th generation principle, which is any decision you make should be made with 7 generations in mind. And how many of us ever think about that? I thought it was just a wonderful principle to even think about, that we could have such a large vision. Because in life and in politics, we're thinking about, people say, what would you like to achieve in the next 5 years? I mean, that's the standard thing. Where would you be in 5 years' time? Well, where would you be in 7 generations' time? It's a completely different question. And it got me thinking about some of the genuine bridges that we have created in life, and how they stand the test of time. They literally have taken us from one side of the abyss to the other, with fantastic engineering. And that's what we've got to do, is create some sort of design process, I think, design the bridge.
Yes. Well, I'd like to take that and draw us into our concluding remarks, because I think, in the introduction, we talked about how your work is leading to helping find people to become resolutionaries. And perhaps part of the way we approach that bridge requires some resolutionary thinking. So I know we would have touched upon some of that thinking throughout this conversation so far, but to conclude, how can we embrace this path of resolutionary thinking in order to help us to break down some of these barriers, to heal some of the polarization and tribalization, that enables us to connect and relate more deeply, but still respectfully follow our own unique paths and see the world in the way that we choose to see. What to you is resolutionary thinking, and how can we begin to embrace it in this unique time?
I think it's about, one of the key principles of mediation is self-determination. It's about, I should be empowered and enabled to make my own decision fully informed. And I should respect that power and that ability in others. In other words, we should all be, one of the things I feel that's lacking in society, Dan, is that we keep looking for iconic leaders to lead us across this bridge. And that's not the answer. We are the leaders, and we can only be the leaders if we recognize the ability for self-determination in each of us and then support that. So each of us has the ability and the desire to make our own fully informed decisions about how we move forward. And when we can do that in a way that collaborates and creates a vision to move forward, recognizing that each of us does have our innate and inherent differences, that's the answer. And it's being able to think at that level and to recognize the difference and the diversity, and yet the ability to collaborate despite that. That's what resolutionary thinking is, really.
Yes. Oh, goodness me, I could talk for another hour about this, because this I'm going to give you we'll take 60 seconds on this, because so I like what you're saying here, but I also have some challenges. So leadership, visionary leadership, how getting the balance between this kind of individual visionary leadership with a collaborative mode, because one of the things I've observed is sometimes in order to become a strong leader, we have to first become a great follower. That's certainly been true in my life. In order to find the confidence to lead and my own self-belief, my own self-esteem, I've gone out to look to others who have already walked that path, so I can learn through mentorship or coaching or training, someone who's already leading in that space. And they may be bold visionary leaders in their own right, but as a result, I become initially a follower of that method, of that way of working, in order to then embody it myself before I become a leader. And there's the Derek Sivers video, which I embodied at the weekend, where sometimes it takes a courageous leader to start the dance, and then one by one people will join the dance, and before you know it, you've got a movement. So yes, and that blend between empowering the visionary leader to be the courageous leader that goes forward, but not in a way that alienates others, but actually creates the context to do what that person did in that video, which enabled everyone to dance. So it's, to me, I want to understand how resolutionary thinking can enable both that self-determination that can lead to individual leadership, but also create the space for collaboration. Because I think we're moving from, we've got this kind of me and we concept that the kind of the world is grappling with right now. And to me, it's about the yin and the yang. And interesting, if you look at our backgrounds, we've got the dark and the light, and we've got the yin and the yang. In fact, in the true order, in fact, the masculine and feminine in the presentation of the black and white behind us. But how we get that balance, how we get, not my design, I don't think maybe it is, but how we get that balance that enables the individual leadership, but actually in a way that also creates the conditions for collaboration. Is there a comment that you could add on that?
I think that's the challenge, actually, Dan, and probably we leave it there. Yes. I don't have all the answers, and that's the thing. We don't have all the answers. Perhaps there isn't an answer to everything. And, I think we keep thinking the answer is out there. I've just missed it somewhere. I haven't found it yet. I haven't found the leader who will solve all my problems. I haven't found the answer that will take us to, maybe that doesn't exist. Maybe we are the answer, and we just have to grapple with this stuff. And, you and I know, belonging to various different groups this year, that despite our best intentions, the dynamic of groups is very challenging. And so we do have to grapple with this challenge of the individual versus the group, the iconic follow me leader versus we're all leaders, the ego and not wanting to lose face versus, recognizing everybody. And how do we do that? I think, that is we've got to leave with the question, and that's the question we've got to ask ourselves. And we have got to do the hard work. I can't tell you the answer. And as a mediator, my job is never to say, here's the answer. It's to say, let's explore the question. So that's my final word.
Yes, thank you. Thank you, Jane. And actually, in reflection, as you described that, I recognized my own path. And again, initially looking as to other leaders for inspiration, it was the leaders that shined a mirror for me to be able to see the leader within myself.
Yes.
That were the leaders that were most profound to me. And I think that's what we need right now, is everyone to have that realization that they are leaders. But actually, that's where, when we claim that leader within, we can create leaderful movements where we work in groups of leaders as peers, and bring our unique gifts to the world in a way that can individually make a difference, but also in connection, in collaboration, can amplify and fortify that kind of experience by coming together. So thank you, Jane. This has been
thank you, Dan. I've really enjoyed it.
Likewise, it's been a deep and meaningful conversation, and one that I think we really need to examine, because it speaks to some of the hearts of the problems that we're facing here. It's very easy to talk about what I call the proposition, or the mechanistic, the science, the politics, but actually we do have to look at the human elements and what's within us and what's within humanity if we are to change course. And I think this conversation plants the seeds of those changes that we can bring within ourselves and then out in the world, that can help us to live a more harmonious life with that resolutionary thinking that can really lead to incremental and profound shifts in the way that we relate and the way we experience the world. So I want to honor you and thank you, Jane, for a beautiful conversation.
Thank you, Dan.
If people would like to find out more about your work, whether from a professional capacity as a mediator or your own podcast, your philosophies, what's the best places for people to now to connect with you onward from here?
So the website is simply janegunn.co.uk, and if they want to email me, it's simply jane@janegunn.uk. And then I do blog most days on LinkedIn. If people are on LinkedIn, they can connect with me there and read my blog. And I'm very happy to send you the link to the Corona bonus if people want to watch that.
Indeed. Well, thank you again, Jane. And to our listeners at home, I hope you've enjoyed this conversation. If you have, and you've taken value from this, you relate to the conversation, please hit the share button, because the more people we can expose to these types of examinations of what's been happening in the world, the more we can start to make a difference. So please hit the share button. And if you'd like to keep in touch with our future content and interviews, we've got a whole bunch stacked up right now. There's some really fascinating conversations coming up in the pipeline. Just take one moment of your time to go to danastingregory.com/podcast. Join our mailing list, and we'll keep you up to date with all of our conversations and our campaigns and our activities. And lastly, if you prefer to listen on the go on audio, we're now available on all the major podcast platforms, Spotify, Apple, most of the audio devices, audio platforms, in addition to the video platforms like YouTube, Odyssey, Rumble, etc. So however you prefer to connect, it's all there available for you. Thank you again to Jane, our Barefoot Mediator here on the Elevate podcast. I'll see you on our next episode of the Elevate podcast.